Hello, Little Woman fans. It was about time that Emily and I got together to talk about Amy and Joe. Today's comment shoutout goes to Eponia, who says the following. Remember in Little Woman, when Joe desperately wants to go to Europe with Aunt Carol, but is passed over for the trip because she isn't refined enough, and Mommy says that Joe probably wouldn't have enjoyed the trip anyway, because Joe would have to be prim and proper the entire time. So can we talk about the fact that Joe's eventual husband is German, loved her for her personality and not in spite of it, and if they had enough money, would have willingly taken her to Europe and let her be herself while there. What a great observation and all true. This would have applied Joe marrying Laurie as well. She didn't love him, but also Joe knew that if she would have married him, not only would she have been lonely, but also required to be something that she wasn't. A lady. That was something that Louisa struggled with. She was a very masculine-looking woman, and it does seem that even some Little Woman fans made fun of her looks when they saw her, which is pretty insane. But I also read that Henry Thoreau, the real-life Friedrich, he was sometimes quite critical about overly feminine women. Henry was very critical about consumerism. But you can definitely see why Louisa fell in love with him, since he didn't really care that much about women who were overly feminine. And so the story of Joe and Frederick intertwines to Louisa and Henry's reality. I always thought that Joe and Fritz did travel to Europe together when Joe wrote her bestseller, which happens between Little Man and Joe's Boys when Joe is in her 40s. I thought they went to Germany and France. Joe would go to a book tour and Fritz would accompany her. Louisa mentions that Friedrich's nephew Franz moved to Berlin and married a German girl, so they would visit him and then Fritz would show Joe around Berlin. All fanfic writers and filmmakers, feel free to use my headcanons anytime. I don't know if I am the only person who struggles with this, but I always have hard time liking Amy and Laurie as a couple in the adaptations. And it has everything to do with today's topic, that Laurie is being reduced into a trophy who the sisters are fighting over, and that never happens in the novel. My Amy and Laurie shipping begins when he goes to see her at Aunt March, and it continues to adulthood when he is composing an opera for Joe, and the only things that come to his mind are Joe's worst qualities. And Laurie even calls her as torment, which kind of shows his shallow dreaminess, but it's also a wake-up call to reality. And that's when Laurie starts to grow from a boy to a man, and he takes Amy's advice and goes to work. It is not just the recent adaptations that don't show Laurie's growth and his character arc, or Amy's good influence on him. It is every Little Woman adaptation. It is a very deeply integrated issue, and the way the feminine girls are put against more masculine girls in pop culture, that is something which contributes to very black and white views on womanhood. This is Small Umbrella in the Rain, Little Woman podcast, Amy and Joe, two sides of the same coin. There was an older version of Greta Gerwig's script where Joe wanted to punch Amy when she heard about their engagement. Even if Greta Gerwig says that she wanted to do a good job with Amy, she's still participating to this triangle that doesn't exist in Little Woman.
Well, yeah. Well, I really hate the rivalry that Greta Gerwig sets up between Joe and Amy. It's almost just like, oh, they're fighting over who gets to be are glorified and artistic, and they're also fighting over who gets to be with the guy. I wonder if Greta Gerwig was sort of like, oh, well, what if Joe won out because she got to be the artist, but then Amy got to keep the guy? And which I'm kind of like, well, this kind of rivalry between them, it wasn't in the book. These two sisters, they just had conflicting personalities. That's why they fight a lot. They wanted different things too. I mean, like Amy wanted to be an artist, but she also wanted to be rich. And I think she had a different idea of how to reach social mobility ish. she was like, oh, Joe, like, you should have some warm diets. And then Joe was just like, I don't know what you want me to do. Like, that whole taproot visiting people and Joe can't get anything right. Like, they were just conflicting personalities. And I think that is just kind of how a lot of sibling relationships are. You just different people. And so I hated how, like, Amy was just like, oh, I hate how like Joe is always like this person who gets everything, and I don't want to be in the shadow of this person, which, well, to an extent, like Book Amy probably feels a little bit, she also makes Laurie work for it a bit more. I didn't appreciate that sort of rivalry. And the fact that it came down to who got to have the man, who got to have Laurie, I hate that. That's superficial, actually.
Yeah, it's so shallow.
Yeah, it is really shallow.
If you want to add, the characters, the arcs of the female characters, then you should add the arcs of the male characters as well. I'm so tired that I can never see them. There's the reason why the relationship works. Laurie becomes a better person because Amy's helping him. And then Amy, she realizes that she shouldn't marry Fred because it's all the wrong reasons. And then with Joe and Frederick, I think with Joe and Fred, it's more about being authentic and also finding home. When I was younger, I kind of hoped that they would have stayed in New York and be this bohemian couple. But then now that I'm hopefully a bit more perceptive, I think that's not really suitable for either one of them because with Frederick, he's not very happy when he's in New York.
Oh.
And Jo is also missing her home when she's in New York. So it's all about finding a family, starting a family, being a family.
Yeah, it's about growing up and moving outside your own family, becoming independent, and then forming a family that's yours and actually, belongs to you. Because I guess as a kid, you're always in a state of being pushed away. And, one day you are, probably going to leave in all likelihood. Yeah, that in the end, that's what the story is really about. It's really not about people finding glory in their creative aspiration. It's about becoming a projective as well, but also along with that, family is also important as well. So we talked about Amy, where she's kind of the best interpreted in the 2019, I would say. Because when she brings out like, oh, well, this is my status of as a woman in life. Like, I become accomplished and the best on my own, or it depends on my marriage. Which I think it's good to bring that historical context in. But the thing is, if you bring in that aspect of the historical context and not everything, then you're not being honest about your motives or your creative in this adaptation. And I know that somebody said in my comments was trying to argue with me and said, oh, well, it's trying to be realistic. The 2019 is trying to be realistic. When people their death dialogue is overlapping. When the sisters are talking over each other and stuff in like the beginning scene, they were getting on top of my critique. They were saying, oh, well, it's more realistic that way. And you're trying to be realistic about Amy, as well in her situation in life. And, it's trying to prevent these people as being real. And I'm like, well, if it's real, if it's so realistic, why don't they even get the costumes right? Why don't they even get the history right? These very basic things. And they're like, oh, well, it's a pseudo. So I'm just like,
that's so funny.
Oh no, people are trying to come up with mental gymnastics to justify all these things. Get back to Amy, like, I like that interpretation of her, and I like the acknowledgement of what she goes through. And I think a good message to take away, which underlines what we've been talking about the message of the book, is how she learns to use her passions productively. It's like, well, okay, well, even if you're not a great artist, why don't you contribute to the state of art? Why don't you do something else that, still makes you a useful person? And I really love that even though she wants to marry rich, ultimately she marries rich, but also she chooses to be a productive individual. When she was younger, maybe she thought, oh, I'm just going to marry and never have to work. In fact, Meg also has that idea. Well, but then they ultimately choose to make something of themselves, which I would like to see, appreciated. It's also very American narrative as well, being a productive person.
It's very true. There are people who are Joe fans and they hate Amy, and Amy fans who hate Joe. I think, the problem there is that if you're a Joe fan and then you hate Amy, you kind of fall into this narrative that Louisa May Alcott had. It's recently read the study how Louisa had problems sometimes to, put herself into position of other women because of her own sort of masculine trajectory. But then she grew out of that and she became more mature. And I think that is what happens to Joe. That scene of Laurie catfishing Meg and then Joe covering that up. Like, she forgives him in a second. A lot of people have problems with that. But I think if you go with that narrative of, okay, I'm going to forgive Laurie as well, and I'm just going to go along because Joe is so great. And then you have the part of, Joe losing the trip to Europe, the chapter calls, and she puts herself above the ants. And then you go with that narrative as well if you're a big Joe fan. Like, Joe didn't do nothing wrong. Like, the ants were wrong. And I'm like, the ants were going to France, and Joe is like, I hate French. But why would they want to take her with them? She just said that she doesn't like French.
Why would they take you to Europe because you don't like French where you have to speak French?
Yeah. Yeah. Amy can go because she speaks French, and she's not trying to put herself above the ants or say that she's better than them. But I can see how some people would go with that narrative that Joe is the best quote-unquote feminist person because they just read the book like that from Joe's perspective and they don't question her. Yeah, so it's somewhat hate against being a girl.
It's a problem with you, Joe, as a sort of a self-hater. She acknowledged that she has flaws, and that's why she didn't get to go to Europe and all that other stuff. Yeah, I'm really against taking Joe as a self-insert because she was like, an analog for Louisa, but she isn't sort of all of us to self-insert. Like, you're creative, you don't always have the anger management she had. Even if you're a creative person and want to be a writer, maybe you don't have the discomfort for femininity. The fact that she looks down on like emotional expression really has such contempt for so-called feminine shows of expression. Like, I don't know how we ignore this. The fact that she is kind of a sort of a repressed misogynist in a way. She almost doesn't really like her own gender. I think some people read queer narratives, or read a queerness into Joe, or think she's trans, but the thing is, from the book, I read her as she wants male privilege, and she wants to be a man. And that's my interpretation.
I am sort of half in the trans theory section, but that's probably because I have been reading so much about Louisa. But then again, I also have problems with that theory because I was reading some of Louisa's diary markings from the time when she was in her 20s, and then, later in life, when she had extra money, she liked to buy, clothes. So Louisa May Alcott liked fashion. When she had Henry or someone else coming for a visit, she would like brush her hair in front of the mirror, like trying to be presentable. I can get behind some of these theories, but not all of them.
It's interesting to think about. I can definitely see that she was a bit gender fluid. But it seems like how, like, Frida Kahlo, the artist, she liked wearing men's, but she also really liked the feminine part of herself. Yeah. And as she grew into that, we can kind of see very something of a similar situation with Joe. I'm sure Louisa herself, I think she kind of liked experimenting with that, and she probably was less like strictly female in that sense. I can see that she was a bit gender fluid, and Joe a little bit.
Observing her sister's friendship with Julian, same with Off Whitman, who was also one of the models for Laurie. But I have a very unconventional opinion that Louisa May Alcott was somewhat lovesick person with her relationship with Eddie Wisniewski, because, there's theory that he was a con man. It would kind of make sense that she would make these public statements that, this guy was a model for Laurie and, he's great and all that. And then with the letters that she wrote with May, they're criticizing him because Louise had her publisher sending money, paid it back. And that kind of sounds like a con man behavior.
Yeah.
She met him in Switzerland. This was like a year before she wrote Little Woman. And he was flirting with his employer and with Louisa. Something happened between Ladislas and his employer, and he had to leave the premises.
I think I would read your blog posts And then also a bit of other information about him. He seems like a character. He is quite a character.
It's interesting because he becomes this Laurie archetype in Louisa's novels that she always writes about, but the Joe-like character never ends up with him. The Joe-like character always ends up with the Frederick archetype. And I think that's so interesting.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting. It's really interesting to see how writers take like little bits of experience lives and kind of mold it into their narratives, and you can just kind of see these little snippets from real life. That particular, yeah, he seems a little shady and also a little bit ghastly.
Like there's the Faustia connection.
Yeah, definitely. I guess I just find it really funny that there's Amy fans and Joe fans, like they have to see opposition to each other, where I feel like yes, the stronger personalities of the group is one. They just have to pit two sisters against each other. That is so strange. Like, what are they even competing over? Like, they're not even competing over Laurie. But Sudman just saying. Because I mean, I do like that, Amy is now being appreciated. I do really like that. I feel like the adaptation, the 2018, it makes her deeper, but also more superficial at the same time in how it pits her against Joe, but then also reveals a lot of her motives, like reveals a lot about her mindset. I like that, but I also don't like how, oh yeah, I'm like gonna choose this guy and I don't want him if he's still into Joe. Like I never really got on board with that, and because I always felt like she was a person who knew her worth. She doesn't have to be in competition anybody when it comes to anything like this. I recall that you didn't really like the 2017 adaptation interpretation of her. I guess, did you not like how negatively she was portrayed?
Yeah, maybe it was also the actor's age, because I think they should have had Fiord play Amy. But I think it was the part of the cause where she gets the trip to Europe, because I felt that in the book Amy was very, very sad that she got something that Joe didn't get. But then in 2017 adaptation, she was kind of gloating when Joe didn't get to go. And I think kind of martyrized Joe in the same way as the 2019 does. So I didn't like that aspect of the 2017 series. Like, I think it might have had one of the best critics.
No, I feel like no adaptation justifies why Amy went instead of Joe. For fact that they're all either like, oh, Joe was too boyish for Aunt March, or like just chose Amy because Amy is just more artistic. They don't show how she really messes up that opportunity for herself. That is legitimate, I think. But the interesting detail of 2017, remember that part before Joe discovers that Amy burned her book? And Joe actually gives her some candy, and then Amy kind of shows regret over doing what she did. I think that's an interesting detail, how like it kind of shows like, oh, she's just kind of a kid who's just like really messed up. I think that was a really interesting addition to that scene. But I think the fact that she and Laurie Joe also don't really have that kind of continuing arc they should have had it. That's something that's missing. And you also notice nobody ever really delved into her days at Aunt March's either. That's also a big experience for her, where it's isolated from her family, and nobody really goes into that bit. Yeah, that's an observation.
Yeah, I think they did some of that in the 2017 series. When Laurie came to see her, like, that was nice. And then yeah,
there was that bit. Yeah, you're right.
Then there's the carriage kiss in the 1994 film. Somebody asked me about how Amy has sort of that arc with the servant of Aunt March. I can remember the name of the French maiden. And she kind of introduces her to Catholicism, which has never been adapted. But it's really interesting because she is meditating, this 12-year-old girl, praying for Beth. And I think that was really nice. And I always liked that scene. It's never adapted, but, maybe most filmmakers don't think that's very relevant. But I think it's really big for Amy's arc because, before that, I think the problem with Amy and Joe in the first book is that they are triggering each other in very negative ways because, Amy's using these long fancy words and Joe is like, you shouldn't speak like that. She's really, really mean to her sometimes. For a while, they sort of become a bit closer when she returns because she has become a bit more better at rejecting Joe's triggering points. if that makes any sense. And then in the beginning of part 2, there's this great scene that I really like. The narrator mentions that sometimes when they were arguing, they bursted out laughing because they realized how silly it was.
Yeah.
Both sisters grew away from that petty fighting. When I was younger, I was arguing with my sister. I don't think I have argued with her since high school. Become more perceptive about the other person's temper when you know them very well. And I think that sort of happens with Joe and Laurie as well. Like they are being triggered with certain things that the other person does.
I think that's part of being adults. When you're a kid, you kind of you see things very much from your own perspectives, and you can't really get why the other person just can't come into your own mindset. But then when you're an adult, you see that other person as another like valid human being who has their own needs, and yeah, that's just part of growing up. And I think one of the benefits an adult, which is why I don't think Greta Gerwig should just think that adulthood, like this horrible, glum experience, you actually mature and actually your life gets better in many ways.
And I was reading some bits of May Alcott and how Louisa started to appreciate May after she had passed away in a more wider sense. They did became a lot closer when, later in age. You can really see that in the woman. Alcott Schooler, Aileen Birch. She also wrote that there's been neglect among some Alcott Schoolers to do more research on May Alcott because Amy's portrayals in the films. Part of that also applied to certain characters like Laurie and Frederick as well. Laurie's not that exciting when his character arc is missing. I am okay with Laurie being flawed person, and I liked him a lot more when he is this flawed person, even though he annoys me, because, I can appreciate his growth when he's this flawed person. Yeah, and with Frederick, I think he's very enchanting with his Germaniness and, how, Louisa was very into Germany and all that. You don't really see those in the adaptations, so maybe there are not that many people who want to research them. I read tons of studies on Joe, and some of them were good, some of them were not so good, but then it was a lot more difficult to find anything on Laurie or Frederick or their real-life counterparts.
I feel like people are kind of colored by the certain profile imagination of these characters, and so they just don't delve into the research as much. I mean, I think that exploration of men growing up as well is also a really valid thing to acknowledge the presence of toxic masculinity in Laurie. I think it does make him a lot more interesting. And the fact that aspect getting is erased, it kind of leads to that over romanticization, as we've talked about a few times before. And so I think a commenter of mine talked about how hard it is to adapt Little Women really tastefully. Because she's like, oh, well, there's all these like different scenes that are very episodic, and it's very hard to adapt into the book or into a film or so. I guess in a sense, yes, because when you have something very dense like Little Women, people forget how long it is. Yes, it's very hard to adapt every detail, and it's hard to put in everybody's arc. It's just hard to do. But I also feel like when you want to make a new adaptation of Little Women, you don't try and drastically you go into things that already exist. You delve into other aspects of the story that maybe people haven't acknowledged as much before, and then you explore those things. And I feel like, an exploration of Laurie as someone who is essentially a toxic toxic now, and just become someone much more mature and able and excellent, a more productive person, I think would add so much more to a feminist message. So I just feel like there's so much untapped ground in adaptations, which I don't, what people don't acknowledge as much.
Loki's toxic masculinity that sort of goes along with Joe's toxic masculinity and how that affects this quote-unquote feminist narration of the novel. If you just say that only tomboys are feminist, that's only going to harm the feminist movement. Like, that's not very realistic. With Louisa May Alcott, yeah, she has this sort of idealized idea of masculinity, but then again, she also has this very critical views about masculinity as the novel progresses. Yeah, that's really untouched ground in the adaptations. There is no balls to do that. Oh, there hasn't been balls to do that yet. Maybe in the future. That will be interesting to see, hopefully.
So yeah, I would definitely like that.